Good afternoon. It's Friday, the 10th of July 2015, just after 1 o'clock, and welcome to UK Column News. I'm your host today, Mike Robinson, and I'm joined by David Scott from north of the border. Hello, David.
Good afternoon, Mike. How are you today?
Very well. It's quite hot in the studio as usual, but we're going to get straight into it because we've got a lot to cover today. So we're starting off with Greece, and it looks unfortunately like Mr. Tsipras has in fact caved in to the pressure, and even the French President Hollande suggesting that the Greek proposals are serious and credible. So what's your reading of this then?
It does seem to be a complete surrender. Sorry about printing noise in the background. I'll do something about that later. The decision to remove the finance minister now seems to make more sense. I don't think he would have worn this. And it seems to be that these threats against the Greek economy, against food supplies, energy supplies, and all the rest of it, have ultimately proved sufficient to get the Greek government to decide that, in fact, life without Europe is going to be harder and less friendly than in its tyrannical clutches.
They seem to be. They're suggesting that the referendum vote last week was a vote to stay in and fight. I'm not quite sure that the Greek people will see it that way.
No, I don't think they will. I thought the Greek people were voting for independence and self-determination. I think they thought they were voting for that. But ultimately, it was a very confusing question. A question that you would have needed several degrees in economics to even understand, because
isn't that what happens with all referenda?
Well, yeah, but they went a stage further here and actually referenced, what was it, 3 other documents, very weighty documents and very detailed text that really very few people, even if you do have an economics degree, would actually understand. And then got people to vote, and then they could really decide after what the vote meant. I don't think it was a great moment for Greek democracy, despite all the flag waving.
In fact, of course, there, as I was saying to you just before the program here, there is more to this than meets the eye, because there's other pressure as well, and geopolitical pressure, of course. The European Union and NATO very concerned that Greece may move over to the BRICS. Well, that seems to be not happening, because they seem to be sticking with the EU and the euro for whatever reason. But this article in Kath Marini here suggesting that Greece is to keep NATO ties even if it exits the euro, and there are clearly concerns in the West that they may have made closer ties with Russia and China, and of course Greece in a particularly strategically important part of Europe.
Yes, it always was, and there is, of course, the cultural and religious ties to Russia, this being an Orthodox country. And these ties, although day to day the power and influence of the church has clearly declined enormously, these cultural ties are very deep-seated, and they have a major effect. So there is a natural affinity between Greece and Russia. And certainly, I think NATO saw this as a threat, that we could see Russia breaking out and breaking the stranglehold of NATO and the surrounding countries. If Greece follows a route which is one of independence and finding friends wherever they can.
So, I mean, what's your take on why this has happened? Do you think, because in Crane's programme on Monday night, the suggestion was that both Tsipras and the ex-finance minister really were determined that this would be the outcome at the end of the day. Is it just that they're under significant pressure from their own shipping magnates, oligarchs, whatever you want to call them? Is it they've had direct threats from the EU? Or were they always working with the EU, in your opinion?
It's very difficult to know, because you're not behind the closed doors. You're not privy to the discussions where the decisions are really made. I think here that what we are seeing is, in one hand, it doesn't actually matter who you vote for, that the political establishment ultimately are all working to a common purpose, if you want to put it in those terms. They're all working to a very similar agenda, and to get any sort of real difference through a political process is difficult, if not impossible. So you're seeing, to some extent, it's controlled opposition. To some extent, it's to divert the anger of the people over policies which are clearly harming the vulnerable, clearly harming pensioners, clearly causing a lot of distress. Where does that anger go? Well, let's not make it go and to actually change anything. Let's not allow it to attack, let's say, the inherent fraud at the heart of fractional reserve banking, for example. Yeah. Let's rather channel it down a political means and dissipate it over 6 months of the year, and then we'll be back to square one. I think that's what we're seeing.
Indeed. Okay. Well, look, let's move on, because the other news of this week, of course, has been the budget. Now, I intentionally haven't covered this in detail because I knew you would have significant comments to make about it. So today is the day. But I thought you sent me this front page. I thought that was a great front page. Really sums things up pretty well, doesn't it?
Well, you've got to love the National. They don't hold back. I would once describe the National as Pravda for Scottish people, and someone pointed out today that I was in fact wrong. That Pravda's a paper that says we're not North Korea, but we want to be. So they take a very extreme line, and so here we have a satanic skull coming out of the Chancellor's dispatch box. That's the National's view.
Just define extreme. What do you mean when you say that?
Oh, we're all extreme now, aren't we?
Yes. Okay. Well, of course, we're going to talk about the budget and obviously also the productivity plan, which was announced today. But one of the stories that I want to highlight here is from the Telegraph. Sale of 2 government buildings to hotel developers will put Queen at risk. Now, the background to this is that you see Admiralty Arch there, and you see the Queen sitting watching the Trooping the Colour. And of course, the government has sold off this building to hotel developers for £200 million. And what the House of Lords is saying is that £200 million really isn't that much. Not much of a hill of beans compared to the Queen's safety, because they're obviously considering a Day of the Jackal style attack at some point in the future from wherever that might come. But really the point here, I think, which isn't really being highlighted by any of the mainstream media at all, was that halfway down the budget speech, Osborne had this to say: indeed, the sale of government assets this year will deliver the largest privatisation proceeds of all time, higher than the previous record in 1987. So he is out-Thatchering Thatcher in this. Really what we're seeing is the complete asset stripping of this nation. So, the Bradbury Pound policy of national credit is based on backing that credit with the assets of the nation. This government is busy stripping those away and putting them in private hands. It's a pretty incredible pace that he's doing it at as well. What are your thoughts on this?
Yes, I have a bit of a problem with the government using words like privatisation. I don't think they should use big words they don't understand. If we were to have something called privatisation, you would be taking goods, assets from the public hands and putting it into private owners. Well, who would those owners be? Those would be the owners who paid for it. Those would be the taxpayers. That's not what happens. The money's sold off to some friends of the government. The assets sold off to some friends of the government. The money's pocketed, and it goes into general revenue to do the things that government wants to do, which often includes buying people's loyalty and assorted other things which we would rather they didn't do. So the assets don't go to the people who nominally own the assets. Remember, we were always told that these were public assets. We all own them. Well, we don't really, because you can't leave it to your children. You can't dispose of the asset. You have no control over it. You don't own it in any way, shape or form. And now when it's sold, you see no part of the proceeds. The other aspect of it is a lot of the time, the private company still operates in the public field. Now, the public field is defined by coercion. In a private field, the key feature which keeps people honest and keeps people serving other people is there's competition. There's free competition, there's free entry, or there should be free entry to the marketplace. And this keeps people honest. And without that discipline, you get a whole lot of corruption coming in. So what we're seeing is a lot of the so-called nationalised industries or privatisation of things like the NHS. You're still seeing the funding is coming through a coercive route of taxation. So there's no choice there. The funding is then distributed through a bureaucratic route. So there's all sorts of cronyism and the ability to have corruption in that route. And you're not seeing anything that's remotely private about any of it. So my feeling is this is not privatisation. It is selling off assets, and the people who paid for the assets won't unfortunately see any of the benefit.
Well, that's absolutely right. And of course, there's a significant difference to what Thatcher did. For example, she sold off water and other infrastructure to private companies, and that was privatisation as described at the time. And then the bribe for that was that taxpayers were entitled to buy shares at a discount at the time of the initial public offering. But of course, that's not happening in this case. So there isn't even the opportunity for people with a bit of spare cash to invest in those privatised industries. In this case, they're just selling off buildings for a song to private developers. And those private developers will reap the benefits. And what will happen to that £200 million for that building? Undoubtedly, it will go to the banks.
Well, it'll go through a variety of routes, and it'll go very quickly because we're burning through an awful lot of money in a whole variety of ways. A lot of it not really serving any useful purpose. It's all predicated on we must help the vulnerable, we must help the poor. This is the excuse given, but the vast majority of the cash does not go to the vulnerable or the poor. It goes to friends in the city, it goes to well-paid middle-class jobs in government, it goes to the friends of government and the people in power. It doesn't go to the poor.
Indeed. Okay, well, we'll move on then. So today, Sajid Javid released the Fixing the Foundations, Creating a More Prosperous Nation. Now, of course, all the rhetoric in the mainstream media about the budget leading up to the budget was talking about productivity, how productivity in the United Kingdom has collapsed, and that this government was going to do something about British productivity. And of course, then following the budget speech itself, most commentators were a little, shall we say, disappointed, in inverted commas, that Osborne didn't say more about productivity. Well, here we are a couple of days later, and they've released the productivity plan, and that consists mainly of 15 points that many of these are also budget points. So that's why I'm introducing this at this point, because we're kind of talking about this and the budget at the same time. So I just want to go through a few of these. Now, the first point is an even more competitive tax system, bringing business and investment to Britain, high rates of corporation tax, blah-de-blah-de-blah, cutting corporation tax to 19% in 2017. And of course, we're seeing the outcome of this straight away. We've got banks benefiting the most from tax cuts. Now, you're you're a reasonably sized business owner, perhaps.
It's small.
Well, what impact is this having on you then?
Yes. What you've got here, if you're looking at taxation, right, what do you do with taxation? Well, you should lower it, right? And the reason you should lower it is because what does the government do with taxation? It uses it to fund looting us more and dividing people in all sorts of ways. If you look at what they do through social services, through child stealing by the state, the attack on the family, all of it's all funded through taxation. So you've got a basic truth here, which is lower taxes increase freedom. Now, that being said, you've then got a few other questions. If you look at the banks in particular, the banks on corporate welfare, the banks, most of them wouldn't exist without corporate welfare. This is not free market. This is not anything to do with liberty. This is a fact that people who have got influence have been threatening the government, and the government are extracting taxation from a lot of people who, frankly, would be far better spending that money on themselves and their families, and they're giving it to the banks. They're giving it to the banks in a variety of ways, some of it more obvious, some of it not. Something like zero interest rate policy, that is an enormous and never-ending subsidy on the banking industry. and it's an attack on savers. We need to do something about that. Actually reducing taxes? Yeah, let's reduce taxes.
Do you think corporation tax actually has a place in any case? Since at the end of the day, the cost of any kind of corporation tax, the taxpayer is paying as a result of, a levy on how much a good or a service costs.
For corporation tax is a tax ultimately on shareholders, right? It's a tax on profits. It's a tax which is quite open, if you're a large company, quite open to manipulation, right? As we all know, quite a lot of the very largest firms pay no corporation tax at all, or very minimal amounts. If you're a small business owner, then you don't have access to anything like that, and you cough up. And it's also tied in with income tax, because a lot of people are in a position where they can either incorporate and pay corporation tax and a few other costs, or they can pay income tax. So they have to pay the taxation down proportionally. Otherwise, people will just move from one sector to another to avoid tax. The bigger question is, of course, does the government actually have a right to 30% or 20% or 19% of your income, essentially of your labour? On what basis does it have that right? I don't see there is a basis. And what you're talking about is simply wealth extraction by government. And then what will they then do with that wealth extraction? Well, they will do whatever they think is best for them and not for us. And it'll be couched in language that they think will get them support and will be accepted. But none of it will be true, because ultimately it's about we extract the wealth and then we use the wealth for our benefit. That's the way it works. And really, that's the way it's pretty much always worked.
Right, so let's move on then. Rewards for saving and long-term investment. So they want to build on the stronger incentives for individuals to save. But of course, the vast majority of individuals in this country are going to be significantly worse off because of their reliance on tax credits and the fact that tax credits have effectively been cut for most people. So I mean, what's your take on this?
This was the bit that you drive along, you're hearing the budget on the radio, and there's times when you shout at the radio. This was one of those times. Incentives for savers. It's called zero interest rate policy. Right? What part of zero interest rate policy, and it's his policy and the Bank of England's policy, doesn't George Osborne understand? The incentives for savers aren't there because the government and the Bank of England are artificially suppressing the interest rate. So there are no incentives because there are no interest rates. What do you get if you save money? Often it's a fraction of a percent. There's really not much purpose of actually doing this. And it's very toxic because by attacking savers, you're preventing people saving for their old age, you're preventing people accumulating capital, and it's that capital accumulation that means that there are new business startups and more jobs. You have a whole range of very serious and very toxic effects on the country. And they're locked into this now. Zero interest rate policy is here for as long as as far as we can see, as far as the eye can see, because they can't put interest rates back up because they'll pop their housing bubble, they'll pop all the bubbles that they've created to try and make us all feel good to win votes. And they're locked in. There's no way out for them. We've got zero interest rate policies until it gets extremely nasty. Yes,
I mean that is absolutely correct. But on top of that, then we've got this whole drive down of productivity and standards of living in the country, which means people don't have money to save in any case.
Yes, I mean there are so many moving parts in the economy. It's very difficult to see just what everything does, and they're ultimately not able to do this. Overall, the thing that had me shouting at the radio most when the Chancellor was on his feet was the inherent assumption that he was making that here is this man, Eton educated, and he's whatever age, 40-something, I guess, and he knows, and his officials know exactly how to pull all of the levers of the economy to control us all and direct our lives so we'll all be happy. They don't know this. They can't know this. They're mucking around with things that, frankly, they don't understand. you've got, on the one hand, we're putting, I think it's billions into something like housing benefit. And what that does is it bids up housing costs, it bids up rental costs. So it makes, by virtue of the government intervention, it makes the housing ever more expensive and drives more and more people into housing benefit. And then the government turn around and say, oh, the housing benefit bill is getting far too high. We're going to have to cut it. And then when they do, the people who've been driven into this position through no fault of their own are left in a desperate position. And they put on political pressure to try and put in something like rent control, and that creates yet more unforeseen consequences, and on it goes and on it goes and on it goes. And every bit of government intervention causes more problems, and then in response to those problems there's a cry for yet more government intervention. And frankly, you look at George Osborne and think, yes, here's a man that understands so much, he can control all of the millions of individuals in this country. He knows enough about their lives to direct what they do and how they do it in a wise and benign manner. Aren't we lucky to have such wise overlords here to serve us? And you might think that, but if you do, I would suggest you seek medical attention.
Okay. Number 4 then. We're going to have world-leading universities open to all who can benefit. Yes, indeed. Well, perhaps Scotland is better off in this sense, but certainly, as we pointed out a couple of days ago, student loans, there are now going to be no maintenance grants. Everybody is going to be required to borrow the money from the student loan company, no matter whether they are from a difficult background or not. And therefore, of course, what this means is that students will be leaving university, as the Guardian pointing out here, the poorest students with the biggest debts. This is really debt slavery, because many people see that they have no opportunities other than going to university and getting a degree, because of the lack of proper apprenticeships, the lack of proper productive jobs that may be available, should they even get an apprenticeship in the first place. So this is a complete mess, and really there is no possibility of increasing productivity through world-leading universities, because more people are leaving or choosing other career paths than university, just on the basis of the debt burden that they're likely to face.
Yes, debt slavery is right. What's now facing our young people is they're being told you need to go to university in order to have a successful career. Now, I would question the accuracy of that statement, but let's just move it forward a wee bit. What they then come out with is essentially a mortgage and no house. I mean, let's face it, that's what's facing them. And that's what they're going to have to start off life with, that sort of burden. I'm not sure what the situation is here. I know in America, they can't even get out of it because it lives on after you go bankrupt. You can't actually go bankrupt to remove the debt, so there's no way out.
Well, I believe that is the case here. I believe it is, yeah.
So you've got lifelong debt, which you can possibly never repay. And even if it's a low interest rate, and even if it's only when you earn a certain amount of money, you're then basically locked into low-paid jobs. And if you ever get a slightly better paid job, the government will have the money off you to repay the loan. It's quite a horrible system. Now, if you look at what we've got here, you may have noticed, as we talk here on Skype and over the internet, that there has been a thing called an information revolution. Universities, of course, have not noticed, because universities are in a position where they don't need to notice, because access to be a university, to have accreditation to issue degrees, is obviously controlled by regulation, controlled by the government. And they prevent other people coming in with better, cheaper ways of disseminating information. Now, there really hasn't been much of a need for a university since the printing press was invented, but there's certainly now, we should see the costs of higher education tumbling, and we're not. And the reason we're not is it's all government controlled, and we're all going to universities with enormous buildings at enormous cost, and very nice swimming pools and exceptionally nice cafeterias, and paying for it. Someone's got to pay for it. If you're going to put a vast, 50% or thereby of the population to university, You can't pay for it from general taxation, so you end up putting it on the individuals. But because there's no innovation allowed into the whole sector, the benefits we should see, which is at this time of information technology, information is readily available. We should have dirt cheap education. It requires your time, your ability to read, and a little bit of examination to make sure you've achieved a certain standard. But it should be the sort of thing that we can do without accumulating debt. It used to be, back in the 50s, people in the American system, which was private sector in those days, used to fund themselves through university, working part-time in a coffee shop and a bar. Try doing that now. It's completely impossible because the government intervention into backing up all these loans with government guarantees has driven up the loan market, has driven up the cost of higher education, bid up the cost to the moon, and our young people are going to have to pay the price. And they're going to be in a horrible position. They're dreadful. I wouldn't want to be starting off in life now. It's much, much harder than it was when we were young, and there's no need for it.
Absolutely, and of course you're right about student loans. They do trap you into low salaries because, of course, the way that it's sold to people is, well, you don't have to start paying it back until you're earning £24,000 a year or whatever it is. But of course, what they don't tell you is that the interest accrues from day one, and so what they're effectively doing is building up, assuming that you don't come out of university straight into a £24,000 a year job. It takes you a few years to get to that level. They're accruing up interest over those years, and that, of course, is making the bill even harder to pay as you go. So it discourages people from even attempting to go. And of course, because it's also linked directly to HMRC and taken from your salary at source, you have absolutely no way of avoiding it. The whole thing is absolutely disgusting in many ways. Let's just move on because we are running out of time. So a modern transport system is the next thing. But of course, they're working really hard to demonize any kind of modern transport in this country. And everybody's up in arms over HS2 because it's being actively demonized in the press. And we compare that with other countries, of course, where we've got maglev actually in production in China and Japan firing ahead with their work on developing the fastest maglev trains. We're still languishing at around 150 to 180 miles an hour, even if we managed to get the thing built in the first place. So really, again, another point here where they're utterly failing to meet any targets. Well, yes. We did actually build a world-leading transport system in this country in the 1800s. It was the best in the world, and we had things like electric trams that actually provided communication within our large cities. And of course, all of this was taken away because we were centrally planning for the car and motorways and ring roads. And we realised that might not now be the way forward. And where do we go? Well, it's all very expensive and it's all very yesterday technology. And I think what we need to do is remember that when we did have a world-beating infrastructure, it was based on innovation and actually being at the very forefront of technology and the forefront of ideas. And that's where we need to be. Absolutely. And of course, in those days, people were demanding that the railways came to their areas because they understood what the economic benefits of having them. The opposite, people have been trained to believe that the opposite is true now. Yes, I mean, if you look at any map, I mean, I'm sitting in Perth. If you look at the historic maps of Perth, you had the tiny little medieval city walled in and surrounded by water to keep the barbarian hordes out. And then it very slowly expanded beyond that. But it was extremely gradual until the day the railway came. And then the place exploded with life and activity. It was an enormous benefit. And yes, it was welcomed by the people and organised and arranged by people engaged in activity through local councils and groups of landowners. You know, they were actually promoting it. Right, so, well, let's just talk about BRICS, because the BRICS conference has been going on this week and they have launched their bank, and their bank is now going to be funding infrastructure projects beginning in April next year. We don't see this type of thing happening here, although Osborne claims to be having that Britain has joined the Asian Infrastructure Bank, of course, I suspect that they're there to try to destroy it from the inside rather than to actually do anything productive with it. Harry Brown in the chat box suggesting there's no money to do anything. Well, of course, BRICS is demonstrating that there is money to do to rebuild, and national credit is really a mechanism that money could be generated for these kind of infrastructure projects. BRICS clearly taking a different view of the world than the Western financial system, which seems to be just absolutely stuck in their old ways.
Well, it's different to an extent, but it's still a fractional reserve bank. So you've got something that's got fraud at the heart of it, and I'm probably cynical, not entirely convinced that any fractional reserve banking system is really going to operate in the best interests of the people. What it's going to operate in is the best interests of the bankers. And you're talking about a system which has a long pedigree historically, but there used to be lots of checks and balances. There used to be a wonderful thing called a bank run, where the reality that all fractional reserve banks are in fact bust by definition, and they don't have the money that they claim to have, would eventually filter through, and people would go and demand the money, and the people who got there first got the money and everyone else didn't, and the bank would close. And this was a major threat to banks, and it kept them in line. It stopped a lot of the inflating. It kept a limit on how much credit expansion they engaged in, and they also had all these banks were independent, and if one bank expanded the credit supply too much, then they would go out of business because of calls from other banks to redeem that credit. So there were checks and balances, and we sorted that out by creating a central bank, the Bank of England in this case, and it made sure everyone inflated together, and it provided liquidity as a lender of last resort, and it removed most of the checks and balances. And the last one was removed when the government put in their credit guarantee, which is not real. If you think you've got a guarantee from the government that £85,000 is rock solid safe, think again.
Well, it was just reduced to £75,000 this week.
Yes, it's going to be 70. After January, it's going to be £75,000. It's in fact nothing. If you think you've got a guarantee from the government, don't. Right? They don't guarantee anything. There is no money there to bail that out. If the British banking system goes fut, the taxpayer can't bail it out. It'll be the people who have got money on deposit at the banks that bail it out. There won't be another bailout. It'll be a bail-in. So people have to stop trusting this implicit, virtual guarantee. It's sort of like the Irish banks. Remember when the Irish government underwrote all the debt of the Irish banks, and the next day restored some confidence to the banking system? The Irish government were crowing it was the cheapest bailout in history. Well, you don't hear them saying that now.
No.
So, there's trouble ahead for the banking industry. It's bound to come, and the government guarantee will fail. So all of this prevents the limitations on what banks do. And the limitations should be by people saying, no, I don't trust you. I'll take my money elsewhere. I'll do something else with it. That freedom and that scrutiny is what they need.
Okay, so moving on then, the Scottish government starting to bribe industry sectors. Is that what's going on here?
Well, it's good to know our money's been well spent. I mean, it's very important to me that the Royal Institution of Architects in Scotland get £400,000 of my money and your money to put on a nice show because, well, give me a moment, I'll try and think of a reason.
But surely the Scottish government now has tax raising powers. They've got to be able to do something with that money.
Well, we're underspending the money. There's money sloshing around up here that the government can't find ways of spending. So we're if you spend it on bribing well represented professional organisations who do tend to be listened to and have their opinions reflected in the press, that's probably not a bad way of spending the money if you're a government, because you'll buy a certain amount of loyalty. Do you think that now that the Royal Institution of Architects in Scotland are going to come out and criticise government policy when they've just got £400,000? Probably not.
So moving on then, what's happening with the No to Name Persons campaign? How's that going?
a quieter week. I just put this single leaflet in that the campaign has issued. The new family tree in Scotland. So you've got this extra shadowy person called the named person in there alongside mum and dad, and that's how the government sees it. And the people of Scotland don't quite see it that way. But so far, the government isn't listening.
Is this why they're promoting 3-person IVF these days?
Oh, well, who knows? I mean, we've got all the changes to marriage, but marriage is still only 2 people. Is that not a bit restrictive? What if you and your 17-person collective want to get married? I think you should have the freedom to do that too.
Yeah. Okay, moving on to some more serious subjects then. We've got another school in abuse claims. Now, this seems to be an incredibly common problem, that schools are the centre of abuse. We've been commenting on Oxford and Sherwood Valley College for many years, but as well as that, we have, we've mentioned 4 or 5 cases where mothers have been sectioned. And why have they been sectioned? Because they were attempting to do something about the fact that there was either abuse happening or child pornography being distributed in schools. Schools absolutely seem to be the centre of this in quite a number of parts of the country, but pretty horrendous situation again here, David.
There is. This is a private school, and it's to provide education for the children of serving military families. And it's a long-established school, and it had a very good reputation. Now, this sexual abuse claim is particularly poignant because of where the school is based. It's based in Dunblane, and it had an association with Thomas Hamilton, the Dunblane shooter, and there has been suggestions that he had some sort of link here. He was certainly frequently on the grounds of the school. So the reason I've raised this here is that the Scots child abuse inquiry is due to start actually on the 1st of October. It hasn't started yet, unlike the one in England. We've had a year of getting organised, and it's due to actually get underway on the 1st of October. So one question I have for the inquiry is the Dunblane papers, which are locked for something like 100 years, and on some national security grounds. I'm not quite sure why they're locked away. I want to know whether those papers are going to be accessible to the Child Sexual Abuse Inquiry in Scotland, to see if there's any link between this school and what happened all those years ago in Dunblane.
Well, that's a very good point, because of course there were allegations that Thomas Hamilton was running children's clubs, and there were allegations that he was getting personally involved with some of the boys involved in those at the time. So, but that, as you say, has been locked up for 100 years for some reason. Don't really know why that is.
No, none of us do. There remain a lot of questions over Dunblane. The families affected, I believe, actually had to sign agreements that they wouldn't undertake any legal action for compensation or to find out more. They basically had to agree to be silenced in order to receive compensation for what happened that day. Right. And a lot of people remain very concerned about the whole thing, and we want to see that included in the ongoing inquiry.
But the inquiry having problems?
Well, a few hiccups. The QC that was running the inquiry had been involved in a case against a Roman Catholic convent school where there had been some abuse. And the Roman Catholic school went for judicial review on her appointment, claiming bias. The court found against them and said that that her role was fairly peripheral and quite late in the case, and it was insufficient to show any bias against the institutions concerned. I don't think a huge problem, maybe a little bump in the road for them. Far bigger problems will be to get the confidence of the people who have suffered abuse and have survived abuse and who are looking for justice. I'm not sure just where we are with that yet. We're talking about a long inquiry. We're talking about years. I mean, we're talking about 2020 before these inquiries will wrap up. So they have to acquire and maintain over a long period the ongoing support and confidence from people who have been abused and people who have every reason, let us remember, not to trust governments and officials and state-appointed panels and boards, because they've been let down by these organisations so often in the past.
So it is expected that the Scottish inquiry will take as long as the English and Welsh?
Yes, we're talking about years in Scotland as well. I mean, as 2020 has been announced in England and Wales, I don't think we've got a firm end date. We've only just got a start date, let's face it, for the Scottish inquiry. But we are talking years, not months. So it'll be approximately the same sort of timeline.
You wanted to highlight Survivor Scotland.
Yes, this is a website. It's a government website for abuse survivors. So it's a .gov.scot or whatever the extension is now. Government website, and it's all very slick and information free, and it's all very positive, and you know, people can rebuild their lives, and we're stronger now, and we've got lots of shots of dandelion seeds and no news. The last news posting was the 30th of January. So I think this website is a bit of a diversion. It seems to be trying to divert people away from active campaigning and sort of to feel that the government is doing it for them. And I really don't think that's something they should be doing.
Okay, and on a similar vein then, we've got this article in the Belfast Telegraph today saying that call for children in care until 25. Now, the background to this is that, of course, children, foster care and childcare tends to end at 16 to 18, depending on the circumstances. And after that, children are thrown out onto the streets effectively, because in many cases, money stops for foster carers and they can't afford to keep these children on, or at least that's what they say. So the children are thrown out straight into the benefit system, and of course, as it was announced in the budget the other day, housing benefit is not going to be available for children, for young adults 18 to 24, whatever. I can't remember exactly what Osborne said. And so there's now a call that children should remain in foster care, and foster carers should be funded for that until they become adults effectively. And this is then really echoing what's happening in normal families these days, where children simply can't afford to leave home until an ever greater age. It's a pretty despicable situation.
Yes. Again, there's a lot of unforeseen consequences for all of this legislation that goes through. We have a situation where we're invading more and more families, the state's invading more and more families, breaking up families, intervening, as they say, to protect the child. And the child might not want that, and the original parents might not want that, but the state knows best. And then that goes into the foster care system, which is paid for from taxation, which is taken from other productive parts of the economy. But only the government can do this. I mean, we can't organise ourselves. This is the basic thing you've got to accept, that we can't organise our own society. We can't help one another. We can't love one another. We can't look after our own kids. It needs the state to do it. It must be done via state power, state control, state authority. And that's the basic lie you've been asked to believe. And then if you do believe that and go along with it, then what you see is simply a mess. They can't sort out what ages they're looking at. I understand that in America, they actually had one state was finding that of the people, I think it was 18 in this particular case, when they got to the end of their time in a children's home and they were essentially put out the street, there's something like 80% were in prostitution within days. I mean, days.
Yeah.
They actually had the pimps sitting outside the gate, picking up these young women and young men straight as they came out of the gates of the children's home. These people are coming out. The state says, right, okay, you've now achieved adulthood. You're now part of the working population. Go forth and produce taxation income and whatever else we're meant to do. And the people are going out and they're friendless and they're being preyed upon by the worst elements in our society. It doesn't work very well. It really doesn't.
And just before we move on, of course, the other aspect of this, as I'm mentioning in the chat box, is that if young adults are expected to stay in foster care until the age of 25, there's going to be a greater demand for more foster carers. So more and more people come to rely on the whole childcare system as a source of income, and people are effectively employed by the state under those circumstances, and what is already a pretty nasty system in some ways grows even bigger.
Yes, this is the whole are people being bought? If you rob Peter to pay Paul, you can always rely on the support of Paul problem. There was one case an economist in America highlighted, a guy called Yuri Maltsev, and he was watching. The mayor of Chicago had been convicted of assorted criminality and bribery and corruption, because the mayor of Chicago always seems to be guilty of this. And there was a protest outside his office in support of this corrupt mayor. And the press were interviewing people who were protesting. Why are you supporting this man? Why are you out here protesting? And one person held up his free bus pass. He said, he gave me this bus ticket. I'm here supporting him. So that man's loyalty was purchased by a bus ticket.
Yeah.
Right? And he didn't care about what the chap had done. He didn't care about the corruption. He didn't care about all the lives that have been harmed by this. He had a bus ticket. And some people sell themselves for very, very little. But of course, one day the bus won't come.
Indeed. Okay, last serious story for today then. The police in Scotland, they must be off their heads or something. We've got on one hand warnings for drivers. Maybe they're spending all their time simply collecting revenue these days. Warnings for drivers who are driving just over the speed limit. And on the other hand, we have the likes of this, where this couple, a very widely known story now because it's done the rounds on social media and so on. This couple left stuck in a crashed car for 3 days. It's what is going on with Police Scotland, David?
Well, what indeed? We had a Conservative member of the Scottish Parliament describe the service that the Police Scotland managed to provide this couple as what you would expect in the third world. It's maybe a bit harsh on the third world, I suspect. The decision to go after motorists who are marginally above the speed limit is only about revenue. Let's be clear about this. It's not about safety. Police Scotland play the safety card. We're the only things that are stopping carnage on the roads and the death of millions of innocent people. It's Police Scotland and their traffic guns. They're now getting to a point where we're talking about 1 or 2 miles an hour. There is no safety case for this. It's about revenue, and they're putting major resources into this to generate revenue. Now, it was a very tragic case with this couple who spent 3 days. I mean, the woman was conscious for the whole time, lying next to her dead boyfriend and trapped in a car, and she must have been presumably in a lot of pain, and she was conscious for the whole 3 days, and no help came. Despite the fact that someone has seen the accident and reported it to Police Scotland. It's a terrible failure. And while you don't want to take one individual failure and say that automatically means that there's systematic rot in the organisation, when you take it on top of everything else we've found out about Police Scotland, you certainly have to ask questions about what its priorities are, how it's being led, and ultimately how much the police, as we've seen recently in Nottingham at the eviction, Tom Crawford, actually know and understand and believe in the law anymore.
Well, indeed, and as you say, you don't want to take a single incident, but on the other hand, this single incident was of such a scale because it wasn't somebody tripping on the street. It was somebody two people involved in a serious road accident. So it's not even the fact that it's a single incident. It is the scale of the incident, I think, that makes it quite so deplorable.
Yes, it is. It is. The scale of the incident is also, the severity of the incident is also on top of other individual incidents, which give a little insight into how Police Scotland are thinking. The matters with armed police officers pulling over pensioners in the A9, and the death in custody of a gentleman in Kirkcaldy in Fife not that long ago, where the people responsible were not even questioned for over a month by the police authority who were tasked with getting to the truth of what actually happened to this family man. So it's one incident, but there are a whole series of single incidents. The excuse which is given by our political leaders, if you question them about this, is I cannot talk about a specific incident. And then that is used to shuffle off responsibility for talking about the matter at all. We hear a lot of that. Can't comment on the specifics. Only on policy matters. Well, ultimately, the policy is defined by the aggregation of all these specific incidents.
Yeah. Okay. Well, that's about it for today. But let's just leave with a couple of good news stories. So here we've got the Forth Bridge being made a UNESCO World Heritage Site. Is that's correct?
Yes, the Forth Bridge is magnificent, right? UNESCO aren't, but the Forth Bridge is. It's magnificent, it's beautiful, it's wonderful, and it was, let us not forget, Victorian engineering's moonshot. It was a much bigger span than ever attempted before. It was an entirely new material called steel, and it is also simply breathtakingly gorgeous. So I'm very pleased to see that people recognise that.
And then just to end, I want to see if anybody can spot the deliberate mistake here, because the BBC's fact-checking at full flow here. So, Spitfires due to fly over Buckingham Palace to mark the 75th anniversary of the Battle of Britain.
As all small boys with Airfix kits will tell you, that is not a Spitfire.
Correct. Neither of them is a Spitfire, which is why it's quite ironic. But anyway, so on the other hand, there is a serious point here, because it is the 75th anniversary of the Battle of Britain, and I have to say that everybody who is from the political establishment, including the monarchy, the monarch, who is attending this event, of course, has betrayed the people that fought in that battle, and we'll just leave things on that note. Thank you very much, David, for joining us once again. We'll hope to see you next week.
Thank you very much, Mike. Awesome.
And we'll hope to see everybody else on Monday at 1 o'clock as usual. We'll be back then. Thanks for joining us today, and have a good weekend. Bye-bye.